The machinery of modern warfare does not move in silence. It hums with the sound of logistics, the heavy thrum of C-17 Globemasters crossing the Atlantic, and the rhythmic pulse of carrier strike groups cutting through the warm waters of the Arabian Sea. In the corridors of Washington, a phrase has begun to circulate among the high-ranking officers and seasoned diplomats, a cynical observation that we are witnessing a war in search of a strategy. It is a chilling paradox. Usually, a nation defines its goals and then mobilizes its might to achieve them. Today, the might is already in place, the silos are primed, and the carriers are on station, yet the why remains a moving target, a collection of shifting arguments being tested against the backdrop of an impending storm. This is not merely a military buildup, it is a psychological conditioning of the American public. Over the last several days, the administration has pivoted between various justifications, almost as if they are conducting a real-time focus group on the casus belli. One moment, it is the existential threat of a nuclear-armed Tehran. The next, it is the looming shadow of intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching the American heartland. Then, the narrative shifts to the moral necessity of regime change or the defense of a besieged ally. To a strategist, this lack of a singular, unwavering objective is a red flag. It suggests a momentum that has surpassed policy, a kinetic energy that demands an outlet regardless of whether the final destination has been mapped. As we look at the satellite imagery of the region, the sheer scale of the deployment is staggering. We see the concentrated power of the United States military encircling the Iranian plateau, a steel noose that has been tightening for weeks. At the same time, the diplomatic world is in a state of controlled panic. We have watched a cascading series of travel warnings as Canada, Sweden, Germany, and Poland join the United States in urging their citizens to flee both Israel and Iran immediately. This is the quiet before the kinetic phase, the moment when the civilian world retreats to make room for the specialists in violence. The tension is most palpable in the rhetoric coming from the White House. During the recent State of the Union address, the president laid out a stark ultimatum, framing the Iranian nuclear program as a sinister ambition that has been revived despite previous warnings. The language was not that of a negotiator looking for a compromise, but of a commander-in-chief preparing his people for the inevitable. He spoke of secret words and magic phrases that Tehran refuses to utter, creating a narrative where war is the only logical conclusion to a failed dialogue. But beneath the high-level speeches, there is a more complex reality. We are seeing a regime in Iran that is increasingly cornered, its economy in tatters, and its proxies defanged by recent conflicts. A cornered animal is often the most dangerous, and the strategist must ask if the goal of this buildup is to provoke a response that justifies a total dismantling of the Islamic Republic. We are no longer talking about limited strikes or surgical operations. The scale of the movement suggests something much larger, a tectonic shift in the Middle East that could redefine the map for the next 50 years. The world is currently holding its breath, waiting for the spark. Whether that spark comes from a miscalculation in the Strait of Hormuz, a preemptive strike by an ally, or a deliberate escalation from Washington, the result will be the same. The strategy may still be in flux, but the war itself feels like an engine that has already been started. The only question remains how much of the old world will be left standing once the fire finally burns out. To understand the current precipice, one must look deep into the heart of the Iranian plateau, specifically at the reinforced concrete and mountain-shielded facilities of Natanz and Fordow. For years, the specter of the atom has been the primary currency of this conflict. During the State of the Union, the administration framed the situation in stark, binary terms, a sinister regime pursuing a bomb that they were previously warned to abandon. The president spoke of a wiped-out program that had miraculously and threateningly begun to reconstitute itself. Yet when we strip away the political theater, we find a much more nuanced and frustrating technical reality. The core of the American argument rests on the magic words that Tehran refuses to say: "We will never have a nuclear weapon." To the administration, the absence of this specific phrasing is a confession of intent. However, only hours before that speech, the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stated quite clearly that Iran would under no circumstances ever develop such a weapon. This creates a bizarre diplomatic disconnect. Washington claims the box hasn't been checked, while Tehran insists they have already handed over the pen. In the world of high-stakes signaling, this is not a misunderstanding. It is a deliberate refusal to find common ground, a sign that both sides have moved past the point where words carry their literal meaning. Beyond the rhetoric, the technical data tells a story of a program that is both advanced and strategically frozen. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff has warned that Iran is merely a week away from having industrial-grade material for a nuclear device, citing enrichment levels that have reached 60%. To a nuclear physicist, 60% is a critical threshold because the jump from there to the 90% required for a weapon is mathematically a small step. It represents a breakout capacity that puts the entire region on a hair trigger. If the administration's timeline is accurate, the window for a non-kinetic solution has effectively slammed shut. However, a chorus of dissenting voices from the intelligence and arms control communities suggests a different landscape. Experts like David Albright, a man who has spent decades peering into the world's most secretive nuclear programs, argue that satellite imagery and monitoring of Iranian sites show no evidence of a rush toward weaponization. The consensus among many former UN inspectors is that the program is in a state of de facto suspension. They describe a facility that is functionally on hold, perhaps possessing the spare parts and the machine tools to reconstruct a centrifuge cascade in secret, but showing no physical signs of doing so in the known mountain complexes. This leaves us with a dangerous gap between the political narrative and the technical assessment. If the administration is preparing for war based on a threat that experts claim is dormant, then the strategy in search of a war takes on a much darker tone. It suggests that the nuclear issue is not the primary driver, but rather a convenient and easily understood justification for a much larger geopolitical objective. In the quiet rooms of the Pentagon, the focus isn't just on the centrifuges, but on the entire infrastructure of the Iranian state. The irony of the current moment is that the 60% enrichment is being used as a clock, a ticking device that justifies immediate action. But if that clock is actually paused, as the analysts suggest, then the rush toward a kinetic weekend becomes a choice rather than a necessity. We are witnessing a collision between the cold, hard data of the inspectors and the urgent, emotive language of a leadership that has already decided the time for talk is over. The Zagros Mountains hold many secrets, but the most significant one might be whether the threat being described to the American public matches the reality buried beneath the rock. The shift from regional concerns to an existential threat marked a turning point in the administration's rhetoric. On a quiet afternoon in Washington, Secretary of State Marco Rubio introduced a new, more alarming variable into the equation of war: the Iranian intercontinental ballistic missile. For years, the conversation around Tehran's arsenal was confined to the Middle East, focusing on the thousands of short and medium-range missiles that could reach Tel Aviv, Riyadh, or American bases in Iraq. But Rubio's statement projected that threat across the Atlantic, painting a picture of a regime poised to strike the continental United States. This was no longer just a struggle for regional hegemony. It was being framed as a direct defense of the American homeland. To a military analyst, the evidence for this claim is found in Iran's civil space program. The administration pointed to recent satellite launches as a thin veil for military development. The logic is simple and technically sound. The physics required to put a satellite into orbit are nearly identical to those needed to deliver a warhead across a continent. We have watched the Iranian Space Agency test larger, more sophisticated multi-stage rockets, each launch serving as a dual-purpose experiment in propulsion and guidance. While European intelligence services had previously estimated that Tehran wouldn't possess a viable ICBM until 2035, the current administration suggests that the timeline has accelerated exponentially. The irony of this development is found in the state of the Iranian economy. Here is a nation under some of the most soul-crushing sanctions in modern history, its currency in a tailspin and its people struggling for basic necessities. Yet, amidst this tattered landscape, the regime has consistently prioritized its missile program, finding the capital to innovate where other industries have withered. This is the hallmark of a revolutionary state, one that views military deterrence not as a luxury, but as the only insurance policy against the very regime change now being discussed in the West. It is a cycle of escalation where the fear of invasion drives the development of the very weapons that make an invasion more likely. However, the intelligence community remains deeply divided on the immediacy of this threat. Reports leaked to the press suggest that while Iran has made steady advances, there has been no dramatic new progress that would justify a sudden pivot to a war footing. The 2035 estimate remains the benchmark for many career analysts, who view the administration's warnings as a political stretch designed to build a domestic mandate for a conflict. This creates a dangerous friction between the professional analysts at the CIA and the political leadership at the State Department, a ghost of the intelligence failures that led to the Iraq invasion 20 years ago. For the strategists, the ICBM narrative serves a specific purpose. It removes the war of choice label and replaces it with self-defense. If the American public believes that their own cities are in the crosshairs, the appetite for a preemptive strike increases dramatically. We are seeing a meticulous construction of a threat profile that leaves no room for hesitation. The ranges of these missiles continue to grow every year, and with each successful test, the diplomatic space for negotiation shrinks. The question is no longer whether Iran could build such a weapon, but whether they have already crossed a line that Washington finds unsustainable. As we monitor the coastal launch sites near Semnan, the tension is mirrored in the deployment of American Aegis destroyers and specialized radar ships moving into the Mediterranean and the North Sea. These are the silent sentinels of a missile defense shield now on high alert. The theater of war has expanded from the dusty plains of the Khuzestan province to the very edge of space. We are witnessing the final stages of a rhetorical buildup where the possibility of a future threat is being used to justify a very real and immediate military response. While the airwaves are saturated with talk of enrichment percentages and missile trajectories, a quieter but more profound justification for conflict lingers in the background. It is the human cost of the Iranian state, a narrative built on the blood of protesters who stood in the streets of Tehran and Isfahan only months ago. In the official statements coming from the State Department, these protesters have become a moral shorthand. They are referenced not as a primary reason for military action, but as a character witness against the regime. The administration's logic is simple. A government that kills its own people is a government that cannot be trusted with the tools of global destruction. It is a powerful emotional hook, yet it has been oddly sidelined in favor of more clinical, technical threats. To a strategist, this shift is telling. Human rights violations, as tragic as they are, rarely provide the sustained political capital needed to launch a full-scale war in the 21st century. Instead, the administration is using the memory of the crackdowns to paint the Iranian leadership as inherently bad, a fundamental evil that necessitates a more permanent solution than a mere nuclear treaty. We are seeing the return of the regime change doctrine, a belief that the nuclear program, the ballistic missiles, and the support for regional proxies are not individual problems to be solved. They are symptoms of a deeper, underlying disease. That disease, in the eyes of Washington's hawks, is the Islamic Republic itself. The argument for regime change is a sophisticated one, often dressed in the language of regional stability. Proponents argue that as long as the current revolutionary government remains in power, no amount of diplomacy will ever truly secure the Middle East. They point to the axis of resistance as a permanent extension of Tehran's foreign policy, a network that ensures Iranian influence is felt from the Mediterranean to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. In this view, a strike on a nuclear facility is merely a temporary fix, a mowing of the grass that will only lead to the same problem a decade from now. The real cure, they suggest, is the total dismantling of the revolutionary apparatus. There is a historical irony here that cannot be ignored. Scarcely 20 years ago, the same logic was applied to Iraq, with results that continue to haunt the American consciousness. The strategists must weigh the potential for a democratic peace against the high probability of a chaotic vacuum. While recent polling suggests that a significant portion of the American public, particularly within the conservative base, supports the idea of removing the Iranian regime, there is a profound unwillingness to risk American lives to achieve it. This creates a strategic tension. How do you topple a hardened, ideologically driven state without a massive ground presence? The administration's answer seems to be a reliance on asymmetric pressure and high-tier technology, hoping that the internal rot of the regime, combined with external military strikes, will cause a systemic collapse. They are looking at the protesters not as a group to be saved, but as a potential fifth column that might rise up once the first Tomahawk missiles find their marks. It is a gamble based on the belief that the Iranian people are waiting for a catalyst to reclaim their country. However, history often shows that external attacks tend to rally a population around even the most unpopular flag, a nuance that is frequently lost in the heat of a pre-war buildup. As the rhetoric intensifies, the regime change argument is becoming the ultimate endgame. It explains why the diplomatic channels have been allowed to wither and why the magic words of a nuclear deal are no longer enough. If the goal is the removal of the government, then any negotiation is merely a delay of the inevitable. The administration has positioned itself where anything short of a total Iranian capitulation is seen as a failure. This leaves the world in a state of high anxiety, watching as a superpower moves from containing a threat to attempting to erase the source of that threat entirely. The shadow of the protesters remains, a silent reminder of a domestic struggle that is about to be eclipsed by the roar of a global conflict. In the silent, windowless rooms where modern wars are planned, a recent ghost haunts the decision-makers. It is the specter of Caracas. Barely a month ago, the world watched in stunned silence as a specialized unit of American operators executed a mission that few thought possible. In the dead of night, they bypassed the multi-layered security of the Venezuelan capital, infiltrated the private residence of Nicolas Maduro, and extracted him and his wife without a single American casualty or a lost piece of equipment. This operation, codenamed Midnight Hammer, has become the gold standard for the surgical application of power. It proved that a decapitation strike, when executed with absolute technical precision, could topple a defiant regime in a matter of hours. To a strategist, the success of Midnight Hammer is a dangerous aphrodisiac. It suggests that the messy, grinding wars of the past can be replaced by high-stakes, low-cost surgical strikes. Within the current administration, there is a growing belief that the Iranian problem can be solved with a similar level of audacity. They look at the success in South America as a blueprint, a proof of concept that the United States possesses the tools to remove a revolutionary leadership while the world is still rubbing its eyes. This special operations mindset has begun to dominate the planning sessions for the Persian Gulf, where the allure of a clean, decisive victory is nearly irresistible. However, the Iranian plateau is not the Venezuelan coast. To apply the logic of Caracas to Tehran is to ignore the fundamental realities of geography and military doctrine. Iran is a fortress of mountain ranges and deep underground bunkers, a nation that has spent 40 years preparing for exactly this kind of intrusion. Unlike the relatively centralized and vulnerable command structure in Venezuela, the Iranian military is a redundant, multi-layered machine. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not merely a palace guard. It is a state within a state, with a command and control network designed to survive the loss of its top leadership. A strategist must recognize that what worked in a night raid in Caracas could lead to a catastrophic entanglement in the heart of the Middle East. There is also the matter of the Iranian military's own tricks up the sleeve. While the American military historically possesses a technological edge, the Iranians have invested heavily in asymmetric capabilities that could turn a surgical strike into a regional conflagration. We are talking about thousands of mobile missile launchers hidden in missile cities carved deep into the rock, and a navy of fast attack craft capable of swarming the very carriers that are currently enforcing the buildup. The administration's confidence, bolstered by the victory in Venezuela, may be blinded to the fact that they are no longer dealing with a weakened authoritarian regime in their own backyard, but with a regional power that views this conflict as a struggle for its very existence. The psychological trap of Midnight Hammer is that it makes the impossible look easy. It creates a bias for action among the hawks in Washington who believe that a sufficiently bold stroke can bypass the need for a long, traditional campaign. They see the capture of Maduro as a sign that the old rules of engagement no longer apply, and that the doomsday order of the Iranian regime can be neutralized before the first launch codes are even entered. It is a gamble of the highest order, one that assumes the American intelligence on the ground in Tehran is as flawless as it was in Caracas. As we watch the elite units of the Joint Special Operations Command move into their forward staging bases in Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, the tension is a mirror of those final hours before the Venezuelan operation. The air is thick with the expectation of a kinetic weekend, a belief that the markets will close on a Friday and a new reality will emerge by Monday morning. But for the strategist, the shadow of Caracas is a warning as much as an inspiration. Success in one theater does not guarantee victory in another, especially when the target is a cornered animal with a much longer reach and a much deeper well of resentment. In the high-stakes game of geopolitical chess, the most effective move is often the one that forces an opponent to strike first. This cold calculus lies at the heart of a recent report from Politico, which suggests that a significant faction within the administration is quietly hoping for an Israeli opening. The logic is as pragmatic as it is cynical. If the United States launches a preemptive assault on Iran, the domestic political cost could be devastating. But if Israel strikes first, triggering an Iranian retaliation, the narrative shifts from a war of choice to a mission of protection. It is the ultimate diplomatic shield, allowing Washington to enter a conflict not as an aggressor, but as the indispensable defender of its closest regional ally. To a strategist, this is the optics of war. Recent polling indicates a profound contradiction in the American psyche. While a majority of voters, particularly on the right, favor the removal of the Iranian regime, they have almost zero appetite for American casualties. By letting Israel take the lead, the administration solves this political riddle. An Iranian counterattack against Israeli cities would provide the moral and legal justification needed to muster support from a wary public. It transforms a complex, murky entanglement into a clear-cut scenario of standing by a friend under fire. In this scenario, the American voter isn't being asked to support an invasion, but to authorize the protection of a democracy against a revolutionary autocracy. This Israeli gambit is not merely about domestic politics. It is also a masterclass in shifting the burden of escalation. If the first explosions occur at the enrichment sites of Natanz or the missile silos of Tabriz under the Star of David, the international community's response is fractured. Washington can then position its massive naval and air assets in the Persian Gulf as a stabilizing force, ready to de-escalate the situation by systematically dismantling Iran's ability to respond. It is a strategy of controlled chaos, where the initial spark is outsourced to a partner whose survival is already inextricably linked to the outcome. However, the risks of such a maneuver are immense. The United States intelligence community is reportedly monitoring the potential for asymmetric retaliation with growing concern. They understand that Tehran does not distinguish between the hand that holds the sword and the mind that directs it. An Israeli strike would almost certainly trigger Iranian attacks not just on Tel Aviv, but on American facilities across the Middle East and potentially even in Europe. The administration is gambling that the American public will be more willing to stomach the resulting conflict if they feel the first blow was struck against their interests or their allies. It is a dangerous bet on the resilience of the national spirit under the pressure of a multi-theater war. The irony of this political calculus is that it treats the lives of millions in the region as variables in a polling equation. In the corridors of the Knesset and the Pentagon, the talk is of red lines and breakout times, but the underlying reality is a search for the perfect narrative. We are seeing a meticulous effort to frame the coming kinetic weekend in a way that minimizes the voter fatigue that has plagued American foreign policy for decades. They are looking for a way to achieve a shock and awe result with the moral clarity of a defensive action. As the sun sets over the Mediterranean, the coordination between Washington and Jerusalem has reached a fever pitch. We see the constant shuttle diplomacy of high-ranking officials and the seamless integration of satellite data and target packages. The Ally protection shield is being polished for the cameras, even as the gears of a much larger machine are being greased for action. The strategist knows that in war, the first casualty is often the truth of how it started. If the gamble pays off, the administration will have its war and its mandate. If it fails, they may find themselves pulled into a conflagration that no amount of political framing can contain. The transition from diplomatic posturing to the cold preparation for conflict reached its zenith in the final days of February. In the neutral, hushed rooms where indirect negotiations between Washington and Tehran had been limping along, the air finally went stale. For hours, intermediaries moved between the delegations, carrying proposals that both sides knew were dead on arrival. The United States, emboldened by the success of its regional buildup and the shadow of the Venezuela operation, demanded nothing less than the total dismantling of Iran's nuclear infrastructure and a cessation of its missile development. Tehran, viewing these demands as a blueprint for its own collapse, refused to budge on its right to enrich uranium or its need for a sovereign deterrent. When the talks finally collapsed on a Thursday, it was not with a bang but with a weary, predictable silence. To a strategist, this was the final check-the-box moment. The administration needed to be able to tell the American public and the international community that every diplomatic avenue had been exhausted, that they had tried the peaceful route before the engines of war were fully throttled. The speed with which the narrative shifted from negotiation to evacuation was a clear signal that the diplomatic phase was merely a theatrical prelude to the kinetic one. Within hours of the breakdown, Iranian state television was broadcasting images of centrifuge cascades, while Washington was issuing a flurry of security alerts. The most chilling signal of the impending storm came not from a general, but from a diplomat. U.S. Ambassador Mike Huckabee issued an urgent, non-emergency authorization for personnel and their families to leave Israel immediately. His words, transmitted in an email to embassy staff, were stripped of the usual diplomatic fluff. Focus on getting a seat to anywhere, Jay. First priority should be getting out of the country. In the language of world affairs, this is the midnight bell. Basabasi. It is the moment when the civilian infrastructure of an alliance begins to retract, clearing the stage for the military assets to operate without the burden of non-combatant casualties in their immediate vicinity. The ripple effect was instantaneous. Within 24 hours, a long list of nations, China, Canada, Sweden, India, Poland, and Germany, began calling for their citizens to flee the Iranian plateau and the Israeli coast. We are seeing a mass exodus from the potential theater of war, a migration of thousands driven by the realization that the red lines have been crossed. For those watching the flight tracking data, the skies over the Middle East have become a frantic web of departures. This is the physical manifestation of a geopolitical breaking point, the point where the cost of staying outweighs the hope of peace. The irony of this moment is the eerie calm that has settled over the regional capitals. In Jerusalem and Tehran, the populations are accustomed to the rhetoric of war. But this time, the preparations feel different. The 12-day war and Operation Midnight Hammer have taught the region that the current American administration favors speed and overwhelming technical superiority. The evacuations are not just a precaution, they are a tactical necessity for a military that intends to use the full weight of its air and sea power. By removing the human shield of foreign nationals, Washington and its allies are giving themselves the maximum operational freedom to strike. As we stand at the end of this diplomatic rope, the strategist notes the timing of these movements. The markets in New York and London are sensitive barometers of stability, and the administration has historically preferred to act when the financial world is least able to react in real time. We are approaching a weekend where the diplomatic tables have been folded, the embassy families have been flown out, and the carrier strike groups are in their final attack positions. The negotiate or die ultimatum has been delivered, and the silence from Tehran suggests that they have chosen the latter. The next phase will not be written in memos or communiques, but in the heat of a February night. The transition from a standoff to a total conflict often hinges on a single, irrevocable command. In the strategic circles of the Middle East, this is known as the Doomsday Order. For years, the Iranian military doctrine has been built around the concept of a decentralized, catastrophic response to any external aggression. The logic is one of a cornered animal. If the survival of the regime is threatened, the entire region must be set ablaze. This is not merely a defensive posture. It is a calculated deterrent designed to ensure that the cost of an American or Israeli strike is higher than any potential gain. The order, if it exists, would not be a series of targets, but a go command to the entire axis of resistance, a signal for every proxy, every militia, and every missile silo to fire everything they have at once. To a military strategist, however, the potency of this axis is no longer what it once was. The landscape of 2024 and 2025 saw a systematic degradation of Iran's external reach. Hamas, once a formidable thorn in the side of Israel, has been functionally dismantled as a strategic threat. Hezbollah, despite its massive rocket arsenal, has been defanged by internal Lebanese instability and targeted Israeli operations that have decapitated its veteran leadership. Even the Houthis, while still capable of disrupting the Red Sea, find their long-range capabilities stretched thin by a multi-year campaign of coalition strikes. The button that Tehran once held over the region has become a fraying wire, a network of proxies that may no longer be willing to commit suicide for a patron that is itself under a rain of tomahawks. Yet, while the external proxies may waver, the internal threat remains a formidable variable. The most alarming reports emerging from the Iranian interior suggest that launch authority for the nation's ballistic missile fleet has been pushed down the chain of command. In a traditional military, the decision to launch a medium-range missile is held at the highest levels of government. By delegating this power to junior officers in remote silos in mobile launch units, Tehran is ensuring a dead-hand capability. Even if the central command and control in the capital is vaporized in the first hour of a conflict, the individual batteries across the country have the standing orders and the autonomy to retaliate. It is a strategy of guaranteed destruction that bypasses the vulnerability of a centralized leadership. The irony of this decentralized command is the risk of miscalculation. When a junior officer in a camouflaged launcher in the Zagros Mountains sees the flash of an American stealth fighter or the explosion of a nearby radar site, the pressure to use it or lose it becomes overwhelming. We are looking at a scenario where hundreds of missiles, the Shahab, the Fatah, and the Khaybar-Shekan, could be sent screaming toward U.S. bases in Qatar, the UAE, or carrier groups in the Gulf without a single word from the supreme leader. The strategist must account for a chaotic, uncoordinated swarm of fire that can overwhelm even the most sophisticated missile defense shields through sheer volume and desperation. This cornered animal syndrome is what makes the current buildup so precarious. The administration in Washington is banking on the idea that Iran is too weakened to mount a meaningful defense, citing the success of Operation Midnight Hammer as proof of American technical invincibility. But a regime fighting for its existence does not play by the rules of a limited engagement. They are not looking for a tactical victory. They are looking to inflict enough pain to force a ceasefire. The Doomsday Order is the ultimate expression of this philosophy, a promise that if Tehran falls, the energy markets of the world and the stability of the entire Middle East will fall with it. As we analyze the thermal signatures of missile sites from Tabriz to Bandar Abbas, the tension is a physical weight. The launch crews are in their bunkers, the liquid fuel is being stabilized, and the junior officers are clutching their codes. The axis of resistance may be a shadow of its former self, but the heart of the machine is still beating, and it is wired to explode. The strategist knows that the first wave of American strikes must be perfect, not just in hitting the targets, but in severing the nerves of a command structure that has already been told to act on instinct. In the coming hours, we will find out if a decentralized defense is a brilliant deterrent or a recipe for a regional apocalypse. The silence that precedes a modern conflict is never absolute. It is a heavy, artificial quiet, filled with the hum of servers and the distant roar of afterburners. As the sun begins to set over the Potomac and the Mediterranean, we find ourselves at the edge of a kinetic weekend, a window of time where the world's financial markets are shuttered and the political accountability of a news cycle is suspended. Historically, this administration has favored the cover of these 48 hours to execute its most daring maneuvers, believing that the initial shock of a strike is best absorbed when the global economy is in a state of forced hibernation. In the high-stakes counting rooms of Chicago and New York, the traders have already placed their bets, and the soaring price of crude oil suggests they expect the Straits of Hormuz to be a very different place by Monday morning. To a strategist, this timing is the final piece of the puzzle. We have seen the evacuation of families, the collapse of diplomacy, and the positioning of a strategyless war machine that has now found its target. The irony of the situation is that for all the talk of nuclear breakout and intercontinental missiles, the true objective remains the oldest one in the history of the region, a fundamental shift in who holds the keys to the Iranian plateau. We are witnessing the climax of a decades-long struggle, one where the technical justifications have finally been stripped away to reveal a raw, uncompromising pursuit of regime collapse. The Midnight Hammer doctrine has moved from the shores of South America to the heart of the Middle East, fueled by a belief that a sufficiently sharp blow can decapitate a revolutionary state before it has a chance to breathe. But as the countdown reaches its final hours, The gravity of the moment settles over the planners and the public alike. This is no longer a theoretical exercise in a war room or a rhetorical flourish in a speech. It is a moment of profound consequence for millions of people whose lives are about to be intersected by the path of a cruise missile. The doomsday order and the decentralized silos of the Iranian interior stand as the final, unpredictable variables in an equation that Washington believes it has solved. If the gamble is correct, the weekend will bring a swift, surgical end to a 4-decade standoff. If the gamble is wrong, we are looking at a fire that will not be contained by any border or any missile defense shield. The world is now left to watch the shadows. We watch the movement of the B-2 Spirits from Diego Garcia, the silent repositioning of the Aegis destroyers, and the flickering lights of the emergency operations centers in a dozen different capitals. There's a sense of inevitability now, a feeling that the momentum of the buildup has surpassed the ability of any diplomat to pull it back. The magic words were never spoken, and the strategy has finally been found in the cold, hard logic of a preemptive strike. As the markets close and the weekend begins, the only thing left is the execution of a plan that has been years in the making. We end this investigation not with a prediction, but with a recognition of the weight of the coming hours. The strategist knows that once the first shot is fired, the plan rarely survives the first hour of contact. We are about to witness a test of two diametrically opposed philosophies of war: the precision of a superpower versus the desperate, decentralized defiance of a cornered regime. The cost of this test will be measured in lives, in the stability of the global order, and in the charred remains of a status quo that is about to be burned away. The weekend is here, and the silence is about to be broken.